In the dusty streets of first-century Jerusalem, no insult cut deeper than being called a Samaritan. Jews would travel extra miles to avoid Samaritan territory, refuse to share drinking vessels with them, and consider them worse than pagans. But why such intense hatred between people who both claimed to worship the God of Abraham? The answer lies buried in centuries of betrayal, conquest, and religious controversy. The Samaritans weren't always outcasts. They were once part of God's chosen people. Their story is one of tragic division, foreign invasion, and a wound so deep that it still hadn't healed when Jesus walked the earth. The kingdom of Israel stood united under three kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. For 80 years, the 12 tribes lived as one nation under God's chosen rulers. But when Solomon died, everything changed. His son Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. The people sent for Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. They came together and spoke to Rehoboam with a simple request. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4, they said, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam asked them to go away for 3 days while he considered their request. He consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. These wise men advised him in verse 7, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected this counsel. Instead, he turned to the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. These friends gave him different advice. They told him to show strength and authority. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam as the king had said. The young king answered them harshly, rejecting the advice the elders had given him. Following the counsel of the young men, he spoke to them, as written in verse 14, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." The king refused to listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill what he had said through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king in verse 16, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. The nation that had stood together for 3 generations now split into 2 kingdoms. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. The northern kingdom took the name Israel and consisted of 10 tribes. The southern kingdom kept the name Judah and included the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The capital of the United Kingdom had been Jerusalem, the city of David, which now remained only the capital of the southern kingdom. This division was not merely political, but would soon become spiritual, creating a wound that would never heal. Jeroboam now ruled over the northern tribes from his capital in Shechem, but a problem troubled him deeply. The temple of the Lord stood in Jerusalem, which now belonged to the kingdom of Judah under Rehoboam. According to the law of Moses, all Israelite men were required to appear before the Lord 3 times a year at the place he had chosen. This meant his people would regularly travel to Jerusalem to worship. Jeroboam thought to himself, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 26, "The kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, They will again give their allegiance to their lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam." After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people in verse 28, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan." This was a terrible sin, and this thing became a sin for the people who went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. The law clearly stated that only descendants of Aaron, through the tribe of Levi, could serve as priests, but Jeroboam ignored this commandment. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. Jeroboam created an entire alternative religious system designed to keep his people away from Jerusalem. The golden calves were likely not meant to represent foreign gods, but rather to serve as pedestals or thrones for the invisible God of Israel, similar to how the Ark of the Covenant functioned in the temple. But God had explicitly commanded that his people make no idols or images. The second commandment given at Mount Sinai was clear. "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below." By creating these golden calves, Jeroboam violated the core of Israel's covenant with God. His words echoed the sin of Aaron at Mount Sinai, who had made a golden calf and declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The religious system Jeroboam established became the standard for every king who followed him in the northern kingdom. Throughout the books of Kings, each northern ruler is measured against Jeroboam's example. The phrase, "walked in the ways of Jeroboam," and "in his sin," which he had caused Israel to commit, appears again and again. Not one king of Israel would ever remove these calves or restore proper worship according to the law of Moses. The northern kingdom began with political rebellion, but Jeroboam turned it into spiritual rebellion as well. The northern kingdom experienced instability in its early years. Jeroboam ruled for 22 years, followed by his son Nadab, who reigned only 2 years before being assassinated by Baasha. Baasha killed all of Jeroboam's family and reigned for 24 years. His son Elah ruled for 2 years before being killed by Zimri, one of his officials. Zimri's reign lasted only 7 days before the army commander Omri besieged him in the palace, causing Zimri to set the palace on fire around himself and die. The kingdom was then divided between supporters of Omri and supporters of Tibni, son of Ginath, but Omri's followers proved stronger. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 22, Omri's followers proved stronger than those of Tibni, son of Ginath. So Tibni died and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king of Israel, and he reigned 12 years, 6 of them in Tirzah. Omri did something that would shape the identity of the northern kingdom forever. Verse 24 tells us, he bought the hill of Samaria from Shema for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shema, the name of the former owner of the hill. This new capital was strategically located and easily defended. Unlike Shechem or Tirzah, Samaria had no previous historical or religious significance. It was Omri's city, built from the ground up to serve as the permanent capital of the northern kingdom. But Omri sinned more than all those before him. He followed completely in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. The city of Samaria would become so identified with the northern kingdom that the entire territory was often called Samaria. The people of the north would eventually be known as Samaritans, named after this capital city that Omri established. When Omri died, his son Ahab succeeded him as king. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 31 records, he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. Ahab set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Jezebel was not content to simply add Baal worship alongside the worship of the Lord. She actively promoted Baal as the supreme God and persecuted the prophets of the Lord. According to 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 4, while Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. The worship of the Lord that Jeroboam had corrupted with golden calves was now being replaced entirely by foreign gods brought in by a foreign queen. God did not leave his people without warning. He sent prophets to call the northern kingdom back to faithful worship, but the kings and people refused to listen. During Ahab's reign, the prophet Elijah confronted the king and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Elijah challenged the people in 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 21, saying, "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. That day fire came down from heaven and consumed Elijah's sacrifice, proving that the Lord alone was God. The people fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Yet even after this dramatic demonstration, the nation quickly returned to idolatry. After Ahab died in battle, his son Ahaziah became king. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord because he followed the ways of his father and mother and of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. As stated in 1 Kings chapter 22 verse 53, he served and worshipped Baal and aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, just as his father had done. When Ahaziah died after a brief reign, his brother Joram became king. Joram did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless, as 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 3 records, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from them. The prophet Elisha succeeded Elijah and continued calling the northern kingdom to repentance. God performed many miracles through Elisha, demonstrating his power and presence among his people. Yet the kings continued in their rebellion. God eventually commanded Elisha to anoint Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. 2 Kings chapter 9 verse 7 records God's message to Jehu. "You are to destroy the house of Ahab your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel." Jehu carried out a violent purge of Ahab's family and the worshippers of Baal. He killed Joram, king of Israel, Ahaziah, king of Judah, and Jezebel. He then killed all of Ahab's family in Jezreel, as well as his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. Jehu went further and deceived the prophets of Baal, gathering them all in the temple of Baal and slaughtering them. As 2 Kings chapter 10 verse 28 states, "So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. He even demolished the sacred stone of Baal and destroyed the temple of Baal, converting it into a latrine to this day. The Lord said to Jehu in verse 30, Because you have done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." This was a rare promise of dynastic stability in the northern kingdom. However, Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. The golden calves at Bethel and Dan remained. He did not keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. Even the most zealous reformer in the north refused to abandon Jeroboam's alternative worship system. After Jehu's dynasty ended with his great-great-grandson Zechariah being assassinated after 6 months, the northern kingdom entered its final period of chaos and decline. Kings rose and fell through conspiracy and murder. Shallum killed Zechariah and reigned 1 month before Menahem killed him. Menahem ruled 10 years and did evil in the eyes of the Lord. During his reign, as 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 19 records, Pul king of Assyria invaded the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his own hold on the kingdom. This was the first time Assyria directly interfered in Israel's affairs, a shadow of the destruction that was coming. Menahem exacted this money from Israel. Every wealthy person had to contribute 50 shekels of silver to be given to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria withdrew and stayed in the land no longer. When Menahem died, his son Pekahiah succeeded him and reigned 2 years before one of his officers, Pekah, son of Remaliah, conspired against him. Pekah assassinated him and became king. Pekah reigned 20 years and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, refusing to turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. During Pekah's reign, the Assyrian threat grew more serious. 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 29 tells us, "In the time of Pekah king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser king of Assyria came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Janoah, Kedesh and Hazor. He took Gilead and Galilee, including all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria." This was the beginning of the end for the northern kingdom. Large portions of Israelite territory were stripped away, and many people were taken into exile. The kingdom was being dismantled piece by piece. Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah and assassinated him, then succeeded him as king in the 20th year of Jotham, son of Uzziah. Hoshea became the last king of Israel, reigning 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Perhaps he recognized the desperate situation and made some attempts at reform, but it was far too late. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 3 records, "Shalmaneser king of Assyria came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. Hoshea had tried to play the dangerous game of international politics, hoping Egypt would help him break free from Assyrian control. Instead, he brought final judgment on his kingdom. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land and marched against Samaria, besieging it for 3 years. The northern kingdom's spiritual condition at the end was completely corrupt. The people had not only maintained Jeroboam's golden calves for over 200 years, but had added layers of idolatry and pagan practices. 2 Kings chapter 17 describes their sins in detail. Verse 7 explains the root cause. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said to them in verse 12, "You shall not do this." The people ignored the fundamental commandments that defined their covenant relationship with God. The first two commandments prohibited worshipping other gods and making idols, yet Israel had systematically violated both. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers in verse 13, "Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets." But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. God had sent prophet after prophet calling his people to return to him, but generation after generation refused. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them not to do what they did. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, and they worshipped Baal. Verse 17 continues, "They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger." The spiritual decline had reached the point where parents were burning their own children as sacrifices to pagan gods. The Lord became very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, though verse 19 notes, "Even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God." They followed the practices Israel had introduced. The infection of false worship had spread to the southern kingdom as well. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. 200 years of idolatry, false worship, and covenant breaking had led to this moment. The northern kingdom was finished. The descendants of 10 tribes who had come out of Egypt, received the law at Sinai, and inherited the promised land, were now scattered among the nations. The worship system Jeroboam had established to keep his people away from Jerusalem had ultimately led them away from God entirely, and the consequences were devastating. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. The 3-year siege had finally broken the defenses of the northern capital. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 6 records the moment that ended the northern kingdom. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Hala, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. The people who had lived in the land for 700 years, who were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were now being forcibly removed from the promised land and scattered across the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian policy of deportation was deliberate and brutal. They did not simply conquer territories and rule them. Instead, they removed entire populations and resettled them in distant regions where they had no connections, no local support, and no hope of organizing a rebellion. The Israelites who were taken from Samaria found themselves thousands of miles from home in completely foreign lands with different languages and customs. They were transplanted to Hala, a region in northern Mesopotamia. They were settled in Gozan, a city on the Habor River, a tributary of the Euphrates. They were placed in towns throughout the region of the Medes, in what is now northwestern Iran. These were not just soldiers or leaders being taken away. The Assyrians deported entire communities, including men, women, children, craftsmen, farmers, and merchants. Families were torn from the land their ancestors had cultivated. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, Dan, and most of Ephraim and Manasseh were scattered across the Assyrian Empire. Only small remnants remained in the land, primarily poor farmers and rural people who posed no threat to Assyrian control. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as a political entity. The 10 tribes were gone, absorbed into the populations where they were settled. This was exactly what God had warned would happen if his people broke the covenant. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses had spelled out the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. Verse 64 had warned, "Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other." Now, after 2 centuries of idolatry and covenant breaking, that warning became reality. The people who were supposed to be a light to the nations had instead copied the worst practices of the nations around them, and now they were paying the price. The city of Samaria, which Omri had built and made glorious, was stripped of its Israelite population. The palace where Ahab had ruled, the temple of Baal that Jezebel had promoted, the streets where prophets had proclaimed God's word, all were emptied of the people who had called them home. The northern kingdom had lasted just over 200 years, from 930 BCE, when Jeroboam rebelled against Rehoboam, to 722 BCE, when the Assyrians finally conquered Samaria. 9 different dynasties had ruled in that time. 19 kings had sat on the throne, and not one of them had turned the nation back to proper worship of the Lord. Now the throne was empty, and the people were gone. The Assyrians did not leave the land of Israel empty. Their policy was to take people from one conquered territory and move them into another conquered territory. This kept populations unstable and prevented any region from developing strong enough identity or unity to mount a successful rebellion. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 24 tells us what happened next. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. 5 different groups of foreigners were brought into the land that God had given to Abraham's descendants. The people from Babylon came from the famous city in southern Mesopotamia, the city that would later conquer Judah and destroy Jerusalem. These Babylonians brought their language, their customs, and most importantly, their gods. The people from Cutha, also called Cutha, came from a city northeast of Babylon. This city was known for its temple to Nergal, the god of the underworld and plague. The people from Ava came from a region in Syria. The people from Hamath came from a significant city-state in Syria, north of Damascus. The people from Sepharvaim came from another Syrian location, though its exact identification is debated by scholars. These were not small groups of settlers. The Assyrians moved entire populations, just as they had done with the Israelites they deported. Thousands of foreigners now occupied the cities and towns of Samaria. They moved into the houses that Israelites had built. They farmed the fields that Israelite families had cultivated for generations. They lived in Samaria, Bethel, Dan, Jezreel, and all the other cities of the former northern kingdom. Each group brought their own language, though Aramaic was becoming the common language of the region. Each group brought their own traditions and social structures. Most importantly, each group brought their own gods and religious practices. The Babylonians worshipped Marduk, the chief god of their pantheon. The people from Cutha worshipped Nergal. The people from Ava had their own deities. The people from Hamath and Sepharvaim each had distinct religious systems. When these 5 groups arrived in Samaria, they found empty temples and high places where the Israelites had worshipped. They found the golden calf shrines at Bethel and Dan. They found a land that had been dedicated to the Lord God of Israel, but was now occupied by people who knew nothing about him. The mixing began immediately. The small number of Israelites who remained in the land found themselves surrounded by foreigners. Some intermarried with the newcomers. Some adopted foreign customs to survive. Some tried to maintain their identity as descendants of Abraham. But the dominant culture was now foreign, not Israelite. The language, the customs, the daily life of Samaria was transformed. What had been the northern kingdom of Israel was becoming something else entirely. A mixed population with mixed heritage and, as we will see, mixed religion. The new settlers had a problem they did not expect. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 25 records, "When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people." Wild animals were not uncommon in the ancient Near East, but this was different. This was a plague of lions, a judgment from God on people who had occupied his land without acknowledging him. The lions attacked settlements, killed people, and created terror throughout the region. The foreign settlers recognized this was not a normal situation. They understood, as most ancient people did, that each land had its own deity or deities who needed to be properly honored. When disaster struck, it meant the local god was angry. They reported this problem to the Assyrian authorities. Verse 26 tells us, "It was reported to the king of Assyria, 'The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off because the people do not know what he requires.'" The king of Assyria issued a practical solution. He commanded in verse 27, "Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires." This was not about converting to monotheism or abandoning their other gods. From the Assyrian perspective, this was about appeasing a local deity to stop a natural disaster. One priest who had been deported from Samaria was selected and sent back to teach the foreign settlers how to worship the God of Israel. So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. This priest returned to one of the most significant locations in Israel's history. Bethel was where Jacob had his dream of the ladder reaching to heaven. It was where he set up a stone pillar and named the place House of God. But Bethel was also where Jeroboam had placed one of his golden calves. The priest who returned would have been part of the corrupted religious system that Jeroboam had established. He was not a Levitical priest, serving according to the law of Moses. He was one of the priests Jeroboam had appointed from all sorts of people to serve at the high places and golden calf shrines. This priest taught the foreign settlers about the Lord, but he taught them according to the corrupted worship system of the northern kingdom. He showed them the golden calf at Bethel. He instructed them in the festivals and sacrifices that Jeroboam had invented. He explained how to worship the God of Israel, but not according to the law God had given at Mount Sinai. The foreigners learned about the Lord, but they learned a distorted version of true worship. They learned that the God of this land was named Yahweh, but they did not learn that Yahweh alone was God and that he demanded exclusive worship. The lion attacks apparently stopped once the settlers began acknowledging the Lord in some fashion. The immediate crisis was resolved. But the long-term consequences of this solution would shape the identity and religion of this mixed population for centuries. They had been introduced to the worship of Israel's God, but not in a way that would lead them to abandon their other gods. They had received instruction from a priest, but a priest who represented the corrupted worship system that had led to Israel's destruction in the first place. What developed in Samaria was not a conversion to the worship of the Lord, but a blending of religions. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 29 describes what happened. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled, and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. The foreign settlers learned about the Lord from the priest, but they did not abandon their traditional gods. Instead, they added the Lord to their collection of deities. They practiced syncretism, mixing different religious beliefs and practices together. The high places that the Israelites had built throughout the northern kingdom were still standing. These were the hilltop shrines where Israelites had worshipped the golden calves and other idols. The foreign settlers took over these existing religious sites and adapted them for their own use. Each national group set up images and altars to their traditional gods right alongside whatever worship of the Lord they had been taught. In their minds, this made perfect sense. They were living in a land that belonged to the Lord, so they needed to honor him. But they also wanted to maintain worship of the gods they had grown up with, the gods of their ancestors. Verse 33 summarizes the religious situation. They worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. This sentence captures the fundamental problem. They worshipped the Lord, but not exclusively. They served their own gods, but also acknowledged the Lord. This was exactly what the Lord had repeatedly condemned throughout Israel's history. The first commandment was clear: "You shall have no other gods before me." The Lord demanded exclusive worship. He would not share his glory with idols. But the foreign settlers in Samaria did not understand this, and the priest teaching them came from a religious tradition that had already compromised this principle. The text continues in verse 34. To this day they persist in their former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Even though they claimed to worship the Lord, they did not follow his commands. They did not know or obey the law of Moses. They did not understand the covenant relationship between the Lord and his people. They performed some rituals they had been taught, but without understanding the theology behind them or the exclusive commitment God required. This syncretistic religion became the standard for the population of Samaria. Parents taught it to their children. It was passed down through generations. The worship of the Lord was mixed with worship of foreign gods. The festivals and sacrifices commanded in the law of Moses were mixed with pagan rituals. The identity of being God's chosen people was lost because these settlers were not descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had no covenant relationship with the Lord. They had been taught some religious practices by a priest from a corrupted system, and they blended those practices with their own traditions. Verse 35 through 39 emphasizes what true worship should have been. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, "Do not worship any other gods, or bow down to them, serve them, or sacrifice to them. But the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt with mighty power and outstretched arm, is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies." But the foreign settlers in Samaria did not follow these commands because they had never been part of the covenant. The Bible gives us specific details about which gods each national group worshipped in their new homeland. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 30 tells us, "The people from Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, those from Cutha made Nergal, and those from Hamath made Ashima." Each group maintained the worship of their traditional deities, setting up images and shrines in the towns where they settled. These were not minor household gods, but major deities with established priesthoods and elaborate rituals. Sukkot-Benoth was the god or gods worshipped by the Babylonians. The exact identity is debated by scholars, but the name may refer to shelters or booths used in worship ceremonies, possibly connected to fertility rituals. The Babylonians had an extensive pantheon, and they brought their religious practices with them to Samaria. Nergal was the god of the people from Cutha. This deity ruled over the underworld and was associated with war, plague, and death. Nergal was typically depicted as a lion or a man with a lion's head, a fitting image for people who had just experienced a plague of lions. Ashima was worshipped by the people from Hamath. Less is known about this deity, but it was likely connected to the worship practices common in Syria. Verse 31 continues the list. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire as sacrifices to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. The people from Ava worshipped two deities, Nibhaz and Tartak. Again, specific information about these gods is limited, but they were part of the religious system these people brought with them. The people from Sepharvaim practiced something particularly horrific. They burned their own children as sacrifices to their gods, Adramelech and Anamelech. This was human sacrifice, the same abomination that some of the worst kings of Israel had practiced, and that God had repeatedly condemned. So the towns of Samaria became a religious patchwork. In one town you might find shrines to Nergal alongside some form of worship of the Lord. In another town, the people worshipped Ashima while also offering sacrifices according to what they had been taught by the priest. The Babylonians in their settlements maintained worship of Sukkoth-Benoth. The Sepharvites continued their child sacrifice rituals. Each group kept its distinct religious identity while adding some acknowledgement of the Lord, the God of the land. The result was religious chaos. The land that God had chosen for his people, where his name was to dwell, where he was to be worshipped according to his commands, was now filled with idols and false gods. The high places that had been built for corrupted worship of the Lord were now used for worship of Nergal, Ashima, Nibhaz, Tartak, Adramelech, and Anamelech. The theological and practical confusion was complete. No one in Samaria truly understood who the Lord was or what he required. No one followed the law of Moses. No one maintained the covenant relationship that had defined Israel's identity. Verse 32 adds, "They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places." Just as Jeroboam had appointed non-Levitical priests, the foreign settlers appointed their own priests. These were not men from the tribe of Levi, descended from Aaron, consecrated according to the law of Moses. These were ordinary people from various national backgrounds who took on priestly functions. They performed rituals at the high places, combining elements of Lord worship with worship of their national gods. The priesthood, like the worship itself, was thoroughly mixed and corrupted. Over time, the foreign settlers and the remaining Israelites in the land intermarried and blended together. Children were born who had mixed heritage, part Israelite, part Babylonian, or part Syrian, or part from any of the other national groups. These children grew up learning the mixed religion their parents practiced. They were taught to honor the Lord as the God of the land, but also to respect the gods their grandparents had brought from distant lands. They spoke Aramaic and perhaps some Hebrew. They lived in Israelite cities and farmed Israelite land, but they were not fully Israelite by blood or religion. This population came to be identified by the name of the region where they lived, Samaria. They were Samaritans. The name originally referred to residents of the city and region of Samaria, but it took on ethnic and religious significance. The Samaritans were descendants of both the foreign colonists brought by Assyria and the remnant of Israelites who had not been deported. They were a mixed people, and they practiced a mixed religion. They claimed connection to Israel's heritage because they lived in Israel's land and worshipped Israel's God. But their worship was far from what God had commanded. The Samaritans developed their own identity over the following generations. They maintained some Israelite traditions. They observed some form of the Sabbath. They acknowledged the law of Moses, at least in part. They identified with the patriarch Jacob and considered themselves descendants of the northern tribes, but they also retained practices and beliefs from the foreign nations their ancestors came from. Their religion was syncretic by nature, mixing elements from multiple sources. Their ethnicity was mixed, combining Israelite and foreign bloodlines. 2 Kings Chapter 17, verse 41, summarizes the religious situation that continued for generations. Even while these people were worshipping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their ancestors did. The pattern established when the foreign settlers first arrived persisted. Generation after generation grew up practicing this mixed religion. It became normal for them. They did not see any contradiction in worshipping the Lord while also serving other gods. They did not understand that the Lord demanded exclusive worship and complete obedience to his law. This was the population that occupied the land of the former northern kingdom. These were the people living in Bethel, where Abraham had built an altar. These were the people living in Shechem, where Joshua had renewed the covenant. These were the people living in Samaria, the capital Omri had built. They had some connection to Israel's past, but they were not Israel. They worshipped the Lord in some fashion, but not according to his covenant. They lived in the promised land, but they were not the people to whom the promise had been made. The Israelites who had been deported to Assyria were gone, scattered among the nations. The foreign colonists and their descendants now occupied their land. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom had effectively ceased to exist as distinct entities. In their place was a new population, ethnically mixed, religiously syncretistic, and identified by the name Samaritan. This was the reality when the Jews would eventually return from their exile in Babylon. The northern part of the Promised Land was no longer occupied by fellow Israelites who had simply practiced false worship. It was occupied by a different people entirely, a people whose very existence was the result of God's judgment on the northern kingdom and Assyria's policy of forced population transfer. More than a century had passed since the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom. During that time, the southern kingdom of Judah had also fallen. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and taken the people of Judah into exile in Babylon. But now, Babylon itself had fallen to a new power. The Persians under King Cyrus had conquered the Babylonian Empire and established a vast kingdom stretching from India to the Mediterranean Sea. Cyrus had a different policy than the Assyrians and Babylonians. Instead of keeping conquered peoples in exile, he allowed them to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus to fulfill the word spoken by Jeremiah. Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 tells us that Cyrus made a proclamation throughout his realm and also put it in writing. This was not a random act of political generosity. God was working through this pagan king to accomplish his purposes for his people. Jeremiah had prophesied that the exile would last 70 years, and now that time was coming to an end. The proclamation stated in verses 2 and 3, "This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them." This was an extraordinary decree. Cyrus acknowledged the Lord as the God of heaven. He gave permission for the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. He specifically authorized them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and he called on the people who were not going back to support those who were with silver, gold, goods, livestock, and free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuable gifts in addition to all the free will offerings. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought by Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Verse 9 through 11 gives the inventory. This was the inventory: gold dishes 30, silver dishes 1,000, silver pans 29, gold bowls 30, matching silver bowls 410, other articles 1,000. In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. The sacred vessels that had been taken from Solomon's temple were being returned so they could be used in the new temple. The book of Ezra, chapter 2, lists the groups of people who returned. Verse 1 states, "Now these are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken captive to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to their own town." The list includes the leaders who came with Zerubbabel: Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. Then it names various family groups and their numbers, the towns people came from, the priests, the Levites, the musicians, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants. Verse 64 tells us, "The whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,137 male and female slaves, and they also had 200 male and female singers." These returning exiles were primarily from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with priests and Levites. They were descendants of the people who had been taken to Babylon. They had lived in exile for 70 years, as God had said through Jeremiah. Many had been born in Babylon and had never seen Jerusalem, but they maintained their identity as God's covenant people. They preserved the law of Moses. They remembered the promises God had made to their ancestors. And now they were going home to rebuild the temple and restore proper worship of the Lord. When they arrived in Jerusalem, verse 68 records, some of the heads of the families gave free will offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. When the 7th month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua son of Jozadak and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Ezra chapter 3 verse 3 tells us, "Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices." The returning exiles began with worship. Before rebuilding the temple, they rebuilt the altar and restored the daily sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as free will offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. They gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the people began the work. They appointed Levites 20 years old and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. Verse 11 records their song. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord, "He is good, his love toward Israel endures forever." And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise. This was an emotional moment. The older people remembered Solomon's magnificent temple and wept because this new foundation seemed small in comparison. The younger people who had never seen the first temple shouted with joy that God's house was being rebuilt. The sound of mixed weeping and rejoicing rose up to heaven. News of the temple rebuilding spread throughout the region. The Samaritans who lived in the former northern kingdom heard that the exiles who had returned from Babylon were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel. These Samaritans came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families. Ezra chapter 4 verse 2 records their words, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God, and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon king of Assyria, who brought us here." This seemed like a reasonable offer. The Samaritans acknowledged they worshipped the God of Israel. They pointed out they had been offering sacrifices to him for generations, ever since the Assyrian king Esarhaddon had settled people in the region. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered them in verse 3. "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." This was a firm rejection. The Jewish leaders refused the Samaritan offer to help. They stated clearly that the Samaritans had no part in this work. Why such a harsh response? Because the Jewish leaders knew the Samaritan religion was syncretistic. Yes, the Samaritans worshipped the Lord, but they also worshipped other gods. Yes, they offered sacrifices, but not according to the law of Moses. They were not descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through pure lineage. They were a mixed people, practicing mixed religion. The returning exiles had a clear mission from God. They were to rebuild the temple and restore proper worship according to the covenant. They could not compromise by partnering with people who worshiped the Lord alongside pagan gods. Zerubbabel and Jeshua understood that allowing the Samaritans to participate would corrupt the very foundation of what they were trying to restore. The temple had to be built by God's covenant people, following God's commands for the exclusive worship of the one true God. There was no room for the religious mixture the Samaritans practiced. The rejection was necessary to maintain the purity of worship that God demanded. The Samaritans did not take the rejection well. Ezra chapter 4 verse 4 tells us, "Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building." What began as an offer to help turned into active opposition. The Samaritans and other neighboring peoples started a campaign to stop the temple construction. They bribed officials to work against the Jews and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. This was not a brief moment of hostility, but a sustained effort to undermine the Jewish community. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language. The text then provides the letter in verse 11 through 16. This is a copy of the letter they sent him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. The letter continued with warnings designed to alarm the king. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That is why this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. This was political sabotage. The Samaritans and their allies were not just opposing the temple construction anymore. They were accusing the Jews of rebellion against the Persian Empire. They claimed Jerusalem had a history of causing trouble for kings. They warned that if Jerusalem was rebuilt, the king would lose control of the entire region west of the Euphrates River. They framed their opposition as loyalty to the Persian crown, when in reality they were trying to stop their Jewish neighbors from re-establishing themselves in the land. King Artaxerxes sent a reply recorded in verses 17 through 22. The king sent this reply: to Rehum the commanding officer, Shimshai the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? As soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. The Samaritan opposition had succeeded. They had convinced the Persian king that the Jews were a threat. They had obtained an official order to stop all construction work. And they immediately enforced that order, using force to make the Jews stop building. The work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill. Verse 24 states simply, "Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." The temple construction remained stopped for years. The Jewish community faced the harsh reality that their enemies had more political influence than they did. The Samaritans had managed to portray them as rebels and threats to Persian authority. The Jews had the original permission from Cyrus to build, but now they had a direct order from Artaxerxes to stop. The partially built temple sat unfinished. The foundation was laid, but the walls were not raised. The altar remained, and sacrifices continued, but the house of God was incomplete. The people became discouraged and turned their attention to building their own houses and establishing their farms. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. Ezra chapter 5 verses 1 and 2 record how God sent prophets to restart the work. The people needed to hear from God. They needed encouragement to defy the order that had stopped them. The prophets spoke, and the leaders responded by resuming construction despite the risks. At that time, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates went to them and asked in verse 3, "Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it?" They also asked, "What are the names of those who are constructing this building?" But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply be received. The local Persian officials noticed the Jews had resumed building without authorization. They demanded to know who gave permission. But something was different this time. The officials did not immediately force the work to stop. They decided to investigate and send a report to King Darius. Verse 6 through 17 records the letter Tattenai and Shethar-Bozenai sent to King Darius. To King Darius, cordial greetings. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah, to the temple of the great God. The people are building it with large stones and placing the timbers in the walls. The work is being carried on with diligence and is making rapid progress under their direction. We questioned the elders and asked them, "Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it?" We also asked them their names so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. This is the answer they gave us. "We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished." The letter continued with the Jewish explanation. "But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. He even removed from the temple of Babylon the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to the temple in Babylon. Then King Cyrus gave them to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he had appointed governor, and he told him, 'Take these articles and go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and rebuild the house of God on its site.' The Jews were making their case based on Cyrus's original decree. They explained that Cyrus had specifically authorized the temple rebuilding and had even returned the sacred vessels. The letter concluded, "So this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. From that day to the present, it has been under construction, but is not yet finished. Now if it pleases the king, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter." The officials were asking Darius to check the records and determine whether the Jews had legitimate authorization from a previous king. While the political situation remained uncertain, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah continued speaking to the people. The book of Haggai records the prophet's messages during this time. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. God spoke to Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest through Haggai, chapter 1, verse 4. "Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin?" The people had built comfortable homes for themselves, while God's house remained unfinished. God challenged their priorities through his prophet. Haggai delivered God's message in verses 5 through 11. "Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home I blew away. Why? declares the Lord Almighty, because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house." God explained that their struggles and lack of prosperity were connected to their neglect of his house. They could not expect blessing while ignoring their commitment to him. The message worked. Verse 12 records, "Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him. And the people feared the Lord." The leaders and people responded to God's word. They renewed their commitment to finish the temple. Haggai spoke encouragement from God in verse 13, "I am with you, declares the Lord." The prophet Zechariah also spoke to the people during this same period. Zechariah chapter 1 verse 3 records God's call. "Therefore, tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty." Zechariah received visions and prophecies about the future of Jerusalem and God's plans for his people. In chapter 4, verse 6, God gave Zerubbabel a specific word, "Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty." The temple would be completed not through political maneuvering or military strength, but by God's Spirit working through his people. Back in Ezra chapter 6, we read about King Darius's response to the inquiry. King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. A scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it, Memorandum. Verses 3 through 5 record what was found. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. The Jews were telling the truth. Cyrus had indeed issued a decree authorizing the temple reconstruction. The royal archives confirmed it. Now Darius not only validated the original permission, but added his own support. He sent orders to Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates. Verses 6 through 12 record his command. "Now then, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and you other officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop." Darius went even further. He ordered that whatever was needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. He decreed that if anyone defied this edict, a beam was to be pulled from their house, and they were to be impaled on it, and their house was to be made a pile of rubble. The king who had caused Jerusalem to stop building was now a different king, who commanded that the work continue and be fully funded from the royal treasury. The Persian officials did exactly as King Darius had ordered. Ezra chapter 6 verse 13 states, "Then because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence." The same officials who had questioned the Jews' authority now made sure they had everything they needed. The political situation had completely reversed. The Samaritans, who had successfully stopped the work through their accusations, could do nothing now. The Jews had authorization from the highest authority in the empire, and they had financial support from the royal treasury. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. This was approximately 70 years after the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. The prophecy of Jeremiah had been fulfilled. The people had returned from exile. The temple had been rebuilt. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles, celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and, as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Verse 18 records, "And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses." The worship system was being restored according to the law. The priests and Levites were organized properly. The sacrifices were being offered as God had commanded. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. The temple was finished. The Samaritans' opposition had failed. Their accusations and political sabotage had delayed the work, but could not stop it. God had moved the hearts of Persian kings to support his people and his house. The Jews who returned from exile had completed what they set out to do. They had rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, restored proper worship according to the law of Moses, and re-established themselves in the land God had promised to their ancestors. The rejection of the Samaritans' offer to help had been vindicated. The temple stood as a testament to pure worship of the one true God, built by his covenant people, without compromise with those who practiced mixed religion. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. Ezra. Chapter 7, verse 6 tells us that some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, and temple servants, also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. This was approximately 60 years after the temple had been completed. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem with a specific mission to teach the law of God and ensure the people were living according to it. Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. King Artaxerxes gave Ezra a letter that granted him broad authority. The letter stated in verses 25 and 26, "And you, Ezra, in accordance with the wisdom of your God which you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to administer justice to all the people of Trans-Euphrates, all who know the laws of your God. And you are to teach any who do not know them. Whoever does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment." Ezra had the king's full backing to enforce God's law among the Jewish community. When Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, he discovered a serious problem. The leaders came to him and said in Ezra chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, "The people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. And the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. The Jews had been intermarrying with the surrounding peoples, including the Samaritans." When Ezra heard this, he tore his tunic and cloak, pulled hair from his head and beard, and sat down appalled. He remained there appalled until the evening sacrifice. This was not about racism or ethnic superiority. The law of Moses had explicitly prohibited intermarriage with the peoples of the land because it would lead to idolatry. God had warned that foreign wives would turn the hearts of his people away from him. This had happened repeatedly in Israel's history, from Solomon, who was led astray by his many foreign wives, to Ahab, who married Jezebel and brought Baal worship into Israel. Then at the evening sacrifice, Ezra rose from his self-abasement with his tunic and cloak torn, and fell on his knees with his hands spread out to the Lord his God. He prayed a long prayer of confession recorded in chapter 9, verses 6 through 15. "I am too ashamed and disgraced, my God, to lift up my face to you, because our sins are higher than our heads, and our guilt has reached to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. Because of our sins, we and our kings and our priests have been subjected to the sword and captivity, to pillage and humiliation at the hand of foreign kings, as it is today." Ezra acknowledged that the exile had happened because of sin, and now the people were repeating the same sins that had led to judgment. His prayer continued, "But now, for a brief moment, the Lord our God has been gracious in leaving us a remnant and giving us a firm place in his sanctuary, and so our God gives light to our eyes and a little relief in our bondage. Though we are slaves, our God has not forsaken us in our bondage. He has shown us kindness in the sight of the kings of Persia. He has granted us new life to rebuild the house of our God and repair its ruins. And he has given us a wall of protection in Judah and Jerusalem. But now, our God, what can we say after this? For we have forsaken the commands you gave through your servants the prophets." Ezra quoted the commands God had given. "The land you are entering to possess is a land polluted by the corruption of its peoples. By their detestable practices, they have filled it with their impurity from one end to the other. Therefore, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them at any time, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land and leave it to your children as an everlasting inheritance." He concluded his prayer, "Here we are before you in our guilt, though because of it not one of us can stand in your presence." While Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a large crowd of Israelites, men, women, and children, gathered around him. They too wept bitterly. Ezra chapter 10, verse 2 records that Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, spoke up, "We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the peoples around us. But in spite of this, there is still hope for Israel. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and of those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law." This was a drastic solution, but the people recognized they had violated God's command and needed to make it right. So Ezra rose up and put the leading priests and Levites and all Israel under oath to do what had been suggested, and they took the oath. Then Ezra withdrew from before the house of God and went to the room of Jehohanan, son of Eliashib. While he was there, he ate no food and drank no water, because he continued to mourn over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. A proclamation was then issued throughout Judah and Jerusalem for all the exiles to assemble in Jerusalem. Anyone who failed to appear within 3 days would forfeit all his property in accordance with the decision of the officials and elders, and would himself be expelled from the assembly of the exiles. Within the 3 days, all the men of Judah and Benjamin had gathered in Jerusalem. On the 20th day of the 9th month, all the people were sitting in the square before the house of God, greatly distressed by the occasion and because of the rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them in verse 10 and 11, "You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Now honor the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples around you and from your foreign wives." The whole assembly responded with a loud voice, "You are right. We must do as you say." The process took time. They set up a commission to investigate each case. By the first day of the first month, they finished dealing with all the men who had married foreign women. The book of Ezra ends with a list of those who had married foreign women, including priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and other Israelites. This separation from foreign wives, which would have included Samaritan women, deepened the divide between Jews and Samaritans. The Jews were declaring that marriage with Samaritans contaminated the holy people. They were drawing a clear boundary. Samaritans were foreigners, outsiders, people with whom covenant relationship was forbidden. 13 years after Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, another Jewish leader came from Persia with a different mission. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, tell his story. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while Nehemiah was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of his brothers, came from Judah with some other men. Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 2 records, "I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to him in verse 3, 'Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire.' When Nehemiah heard these things, he sat down and wept. For some days he mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. His prayer is recorded in verses 5 through 11. He confessed the sins of Israel and asked God to remember his covenant promises. Then he asked God to give him success when he approached King Artaxerxes with a request. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king, a position of trust and influence. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, Nehemiah took the wine and gave it to the king. He had not been sad in the king's presence before, so the king asked him in chapter 2 verse 2, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." Nehemiah was afraid, but he answered the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king asked him, "What is it you want?" Then Nehemiah prayed to the God of heaven, and he answered the king in verses 5 through 8. "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then I asked him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy?" The king granted his requests because the gracious hand of God was on him. Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem with the king's letters and royal protection. When he arrived, he rested 3 days. Then he set out during the night with a few others. He had not told anyone what his God had put in his heart to do for Jerusalem. Verse 12 states, "There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night he went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire." He continued on, inspecting the condition of the walls all around the city. Then Nehemiah said to the officials and the rest of the people in verse 17 and 18, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed the Jews. "What is this you are doing?" they asked in verse 19. "Are you rebelling against the king?" Sanballat was the governor of Samaria. He was a Samaritan leader with significant political power. Tobiah was an Ammonite official who also had authority in the region. These men immediately opposed Nehemiah's plan to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. They saw a fortified Jerusalem as a threat to their own power and influence. Nehemiah answered them in verse 20, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." This was another clear rejection. Just as Zerubbabel had told the Samaritans they had no part in building the temple, Nehemiah now told them they had no part in Jerusalem. When Sanballat heard that the Jews were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said in Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." This mockery was designed to discourage the Jews and make them give up. But Nehemiah prayed in verse 4 and 5, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So the Jews rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But Nehemiah and the people prayed to God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. The Jews in Jerusalem became discouraged. Those in Judah said in verse 10, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Meanwhile, their enemies were saying, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told Nehemiah 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." Therefore Nehemiah stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After looking things over, Nehemiah stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people in verse 14, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes." When their enemies heard that the plot was known and God had frustrated it, all the Jews returned to the wall, each to their own work. From that day on, half of Nehemiah's men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. The opposition continued with different tactics. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of their enemies sent Nehemiah a message in chapter 6, verse 2. "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm him, so Nehemiah sent messengers to them with this reply: "I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent him the same message, and each time he gave them the same answer. This was an attempt to lure Nehemiah away from Jerusalem, where they could attack or kill him. Then, the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to Nehemiah with an open letter in his hand. It read in verses 6 through 7, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together." This was an attempt at blackmail and intimidation. Sanballat was threatening to report Nehemiah to the Persian king as a rebel. Nehemiah sent a reply in verse 8, "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head." Nehemiah recognized the strategy in verse 9. "They were all trying to frighten us, thinking, their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands." There were more schemes involving false prophets trying to trap Nehemiah, but he remained focused. The wall was completed on the 25th of Elul, in 52 days. When all their enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of God. After Nehemiah completed the wall, he continued implementing reforms to separate the Jewish community from foreign influence. Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 23 records another discovery. "Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. Nehemiah rebuked them and called curses down on them. He beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. He made them take an oath in God's name in verse 25. You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." Nehemiah reminded them of Solomon's example in verses 26 and 27. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and Nehemiah drove him away. This incident was significant. A member of the high priestly family had married into Sanballat's family, the Samaritan governor who had opposed the wall building. Nehemiah expelled this priest from Jerusalem. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote centuries later, this expelled priest was named Manasseh. Josephus records that Manasseh went to his father-in-law, Sanballat, in Samaria, and many other Jews who had married foreign women followed him. Sanballat saw an opportunity. He told these expelled Jews that he would build them a temple on Mount Gerizim, where they could worship and where Manasseh could serve as high priest. Mount Gerizim was a mountain near the ancient city of Shechem, a place with deep significance in Israelite history. It was on Mount Gerizim that Joshua had the people stand to hear the blessings of the covenant, while the curses were read from Mount Ebal opposite. Deuteronomy chapter 11 verses 29 and 30 records God's command through Moses. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land you are entering to possess, you are to proclaim on Mount Gerizim the blessings and on Mount Ebal the curses. As you know, these mountains are across the Jordan, westward toward the setting sun, near the great trees of Moreh, in the territory of those Canaanites living in the Arabah, in the vicinity of Gilgal. The Samaritans chose this mountain because of its historical connection to the covenant. Sanballat built a temple on Mount Gerizim that was designed to rival the temple in Jerusalem. It had altars, courtyards, and a priesthood. The expelled Jewish priests who had married Samaritan women now had a place to serve. The Samaritans now had their own temple where they could worship the God of Israel according to their understanding. They did not need to go to Jerusalem. They did not need to submit to the authority of the Jewish priests and leaders who had rejected them. They had their own religious center, their own priesthood, and their own mountain where they claimed God should be worshipped. This temple on Mount Gerizim became the center of Samaritan worship. The Samaritans believed that Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, was the place God had chosen for his name to dwell. They pointed to the historical events that had happened there. Abraham had built an altar near Shechem when he first arrived in the Promised Land. Jacob had bought land near Shechem and built an altar. Joshua had renewed the covenant at Shechem. The Samaritans argued that their temple was on the true holy mountain, while the Jews had wrongly established worship in Jerusalem, which had been a Jebusite city with no connection to the patriarchs. The existence of two temples, one in Jerusalem and one on Mount Gerizim, made the split between Jews and Samaritans complete. It was no longer just about ethnicity or politics. It was about competing claims to be the true worshippers of God. Both groups claimed to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Both claimed to follow the law of Moses, but they worshipped in different places, had different priesthoods, and increasingly developed different understandings of what God required. The religious division was now institutionalized in stone and mortar on two different mountains. The Samaritans accepted the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as their scripture. This collection, known as the Pentateuch or Torah, contained the law and the foundational stories of creation, the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, and the wilderness wandering. The Samaritans produced their own version of these 5 books, written in an ancient Hebrew script. This became known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. It was similar to the Jewish Torah but had some significant differences. The most important difference was that the Samaritan Pentateuch identified Mount Gerizim as the place God chose for his name to dwell. In several places where the Jewish text said God would choose a place for worship, the Samaritan version specifically named Mount Gerizim. For example, after the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy, the Samaritan version added text stating that an altar should be built on Mount Gerizim. These changes supported the Samaritan claim that their temple was the legitimate place of worship, not Jerusalem. However, the Samaritans rejected all the other books of the Hebrew Bible. They did not accept the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, or any of the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel. This was a major difference from the Jews, who accepted these books as scripture. The books the Samaritans rejected were the very books that established Jerusalem as the city of David, described the building of Solomon's temple, and contained the prophecies about the Messiah coming from the line of David. By rejecting these books, the Samaritans rejected the special status of Jerusalem and the Davidic dynasty. The Samaritans also rejected the Jewish oral traditions and interpretations that were developing during this period. The Jews were building an extensive system of interpretations and applications of the law, taught by rabbis and scribes. The Samaritans kept a simpler approach, focusing only on the written text of the 5 books of Moses. This meant that Jewish and Samaritan understanding of how to keep the law diverged significantly over time. They celebrated the same festivals, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, but with different customs and at different times because they calculated the calendar differently. The Samaritan priesthood claimed descent from Aaron through Eleazar and his son Phinehas, just as the Jewish priesthood did. But the Jews did not recognize the Samaritan priests as legitimate because they were not serving at the temple in Jerusalem and because some had intermarried with foreign women. The Samaritans did not recognize the authority of the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem. Each group had its own priesthood, performing its own sacrifices on its own mountain. Each group claimed to be maintaining the true worship established by Moses, while the other had fallen into error. The Samaritans developed their own expectations about a coming Redeemer figure. Like the Jews, they believed a deliverer would come, but they based this only on passages in the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, where Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." The Samaritans called this figure the Taheb, meaning the one who returns or restorer. They believed he would come to restore true worship and vindicate their claims about Mount Gerizim. The Jews, drawing from the prophetic books the Samaritans rejected, expected a Messiah from David's line who would rule in Jerusalem. The theological gap between Jews and Samaritans widened with each generation. They shared a common foundation in the 5 books of Moses and claimed to worship the same God, but they disagreed about where to worship, which books were scripture, how to interpret the law, who had legitimate priests, and what God's future plans were. They had become 2 distinct religious communities, each claiming to be the true continuation of ancient Israel, each viewing the other as corrupted and illegitimate. The scriptures they read were different. The traditions they followed were different. The hopes they held were different. Over the following centuries, the hostility between Jews and Samaritans only deepened. Around 128 BCE, about 400 years after the Samaritan temple was built, the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus destroyed it. John Hyrcanus was a Hasmonean ruler who expanded Jewish territory and forcibly converted some surrounding peoples. He led his army to Mount Gerizim and completely destroyed the Samaritan temple. This was an act of war and religious aggression that the Samaritans never forgot. Although the temple was gone, the Samaritans continued to regard Mount Gerizim as the holy place and performed sacrifices there without a temple building. The Jews developed contempt for Samaritans that went beyond mere religious disagreement. Jewish rabbinical writings from later periods declared that Samaritans were equivalent to Gentiles for purposes of purity laws. Jews would not eat food prepared by Samaritans. They would not drink from vessels Samaritans had used. They would not enter Samaritan homes. If a Jew was traveling from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south, they would take the longer route across the Jordan River and through Perea, rather than travel straight south through Samaria. This added days to the journey, but most Jews preferred that to having any contact with Samaritans. The Samaritans returned the hostility. They would sometimes harass Jewish pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for the festivals. There were incidents where Samaritans defiled the Jewish temple or disrupted worship. The mutual hatred was not just theological, but personal and communal. Each group told their children stories about the wickedness and unfaithfulness of the other group. Each claimed to be the faithful remnant while the other was apostate. The division that began with political rebellion under Jeroboam was deepened by Assyrian deportations and population mixing, was solidified by the rejection during temple building, had now become permanent and unbridgeable. By the time of Jesus, this situation had existed for centuries. The Gospel of John, chapter 4, verse 9, records the shocked response of a Samaritan woman when Jesus, a Jew, asked her for water. "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." The parenthetical explanation shows how unusual any positive interaction between Jews and Samaritans was. Later in the same conversation, the woman brought up the central religious dispute in verse 20. "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." The conflict over worship locations that began centuries earlier was still the defining issue. When Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, it was shocking to his Jewish audience precisely because of this deep-seated hatred. The story of a Samaritan helping a wounded Jewish man when Jewish religious leaders had passed by would have been almost unthinkable. When Jesus healed 10 lepers and only one returned to thank him, Luke chapter 17 verse 16 notes, "He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan." Jesus remarked on this in verse 18, "Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Even in his own words, Jesus identified the Samaritan as a foreigner, an outsider, not one of the Jewish people. The worst insult Jewish leaders could hurl at Jesus was recorded in John chapter 8 verse 48. "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?" Being called a Samaritan was equivalent to being called demon-possessed. It was a term of ultimate religious contempt. When Jesus sent out his 12 disciples in Matthew chapter 10, he commanded them in verses 5 and 6, "Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel." The Samaritans were grouped with Gentiles as people outside the scope of his mission to Israel, though he would later include both Gentiles and Samaritans in the expansion of the gospel. The divide between Jews and Samaritans was complete and permanent by the 1st century. Two peoples who shared a common ancestor in Abraham, who both claimed to worship the God of Israel, who both treasured the law of Moses, who lived side by side in the same land, viewed each other with contempt and hatred. The Jews saw the Samaritans as mongrel half-breeds who practiced corrupted religion and worshipped in the wrong place. The Samaritans saw the Jews as prideful legalists who had wrongly elevated Jerusalem and rejected the true holy mountain. Neither group would compromise. Neither would acknowledge the other's claims. Neither would fellowship with the other. The seeds of division planted 1,000 years earlier when Jeroboam rebelled had grown into a tree whose bitter fruit poisoned relationships between these two peoples. This was the state of Jewish-Samaritan relations into which Jesus spoke his radical words of love and inclusion. The story of the Samaritans reveals how a single act of rebellion can echo through centuries, creating divisions that seem impossible to heal. What began as political separation under Jeroboam became ethnic mixing under Assyrian conquest, then religious rejection during the temple rebuilding, and finally permanent hostility with competing temples and scriptures. By the time Jesus arrived, Jews and Samaritans had been enemies for over 700 years, each claiming to be God's true people while despising the other. If this deep dive into biblical history opened your eyes to the complex background behind the gospel stories, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. Share this video with someone who wants to understand the Bible more deeply. The hatred between Jews and Samaritans makes Jesus' interactions with Samaritans, the woman at the well, the Good Samaritan, the grateful leper, even more radical and powerful. Understanding this history helps us grasp just how revolutionary his message of love and inclusion truly was.